Welcome back to the Blazor Server in-depth course. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at updating our data. So we have created data and we're reading data, but now what do? We want to update some data. Okay, so we have some data you want to work with and we want to change something. What do? All right, so let's All right, so set no count on, and then we're going to do a update dbo.people set first name equals first name, last name equals last name, and date of birth equals date of birth, where, and this is very important, ID equals ID. If you don't set this, and let's tab this over. If you don't set this where statement, then what will happen is you will update every record with whatever you're inserting. That'd be horrible. So make sure that you have the where statement and limit this. It's one of those rookie mistakes that pretty much all of us have done at one point or another. So let's save this. We want to create one more. So let's create a store procedure. Let's say add store procedure. This is going to be sp people. Instead of just read, I'm going to say read one. And I'm going to pass in an ID. And what this is going to do is it's going to just get us back one record. So select star from dbo.people where ID equals ID. And we'll expand out that wildcard. The reason we're going to have this, this store procedure is because we're going to pass around the ID. So when we say, hey, we want to modify this other page, or modify this record, we're going to go to a different page. We're going to pass in that ID. And then based upon that ID, we can look up the rest of the information. That way we're not trying to pass around all of this data and maybe even trusting the users to get it right. So we're just going to pass around the ID and then do a new lookup, and from there we can update the data. Okay? So now let's go over to our support library. Inside of Person SQL Data Service, we have read people. And what I'm going to do is I'll just create an overload for this that passes in the ID. So int ID. And then we can do here is I can say ID equals ID. So it's the same, and we got to change the store procedure. sp people underscore read one. I should just put one at the end. So what this is going to do is it's going to read the people, but instead of a list of person, we're just going to return back one person. And so I'll do people dot first or default. So what that's going to do is it's going to call this read one based upon the ID. and it's going to load that information, which still comes back as a list of person model. But I'm just going to grab the first one because that's all there should be is one. There should never be, I don't think there's a way you can have more than one unless you messed up your database, because it's based upon the ID lookup, which that ID has to be unique. So first to default is going to work just fine for us. If there's nothing in this, first to default will return back a null for us. That's the default. And we'll have to handle that and make sure we got it right. So that's the read people with the overload. Let's control dot to pull read people up to iPerson data service. And now what we're going to do is we're going to do one more. And this is going to be public async task update person. Instead of people, it's just person. And we'll pass in just like up here, we're going to pass in an iPerson model. iPerson model person. And then we're going to, again, just like up here, we're going to save this data. So I'm going to copy and paste this. And it will be person. We pass the whole thing in because we're updating the full object, including the ID. We're not updating the ID, but we have to pass the ID in as one of the parameters. And again, people, it's not. Bring in our inject statement. Inject, and this is going to be, I forget, iPerson data is what we're calling it. It's best to be consistent across the way, so there's our person data. So what I can do is I can say, let's grab the a private. This is going to be a iPerson model. And this will be person. And so here we can say person equals await person data dot read people, but pass in our ID. Notice the overload. And that should get us back one person. All right. So that's the one person that gets loaded here. This is now what we work on. So our model equals at person. Now there's only one snag here, and that is we do have this person coming back is going to be the person from the support library, not the one that has our annotations on it for our validation. So let's make this a two-step process. We're going to say var p equals, and then what we're going to do is say person equals, so that person, we're going to have this be our data annotation version, equals new data person, is it data person model or display person model? Display person model, where we have ID equals p.id, first name equals p.firstname, last name equals p.last name, and date of birth equals p.date of birth. Now this is where a tool like AutoMapper makes things easier, because AutoMapper would have done this for me, but this is just a simple mapping, where I'm mapping from one object type to another. And this other one gives me my data annotations that I want for my front end. That's not a big deal for when I read people and I just display them, because I'm not doing any kind of validation work. But here, I need to do some validation work, therefore I need to translate it into the correct type. I'm still putting it into an iPerson model, but it can do the validation based upon it. Now we also need to have a, let's create up here, we have a, on valid submit. And we're going to have our handle valid submit. And this is where we're going to do some type of work. So private async task handle valid submit. And what we're going to do is, since we have a valid user, we can just call the person data dot update person and pass in our person. And we need to await that. And once we're done, then we can wipe it out, or we can do something else. And I think what we need to do is do an event callback here. So let's create another parameter, and we will call this a public event callback, and let's just pass a string. Doesn't really matter. In fact, we'll probably ignore the message coming back, but on submit, like so. And I should have made this a property. And let's call this actually not on submit, but on update. So down here, once we've updated, then we can say on update dot invoke async, and just say update complete. Even better yet, what we can do is we could update and send back an iPerson model for that, and just say person. So, and this is async and it's awaitable, so await, like so. So now we can update and call the on update. And what that will do is it will tell the caller, hey, we're done. Go ahead and stop showing me. And also, here's the new data. So you can update your display with the new data. And what that will do is it will save a database round trip. Because instead of saying, okay, there's been an update, now go back to the database and get all the data so I can redraw the entire screen so that I know that I have the latest information, I can just take the person that has been changed and update that person's information, and then that will update the display. No need for a database round trip. So now we just need to actually show our form. Now the ideal place to put this form would be to replace this section right here with the equivalent that is a form. Unfortunately, the table isn't a real big fan of having a form inside of it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take this table here, and I'm going to cut it out temporarily. And then I'm going to say div class equals row. And then inside here, I'll say div class equals column. And this is going to be a, let's do a medium column. And this is going to be 8. Okay, so it's going to be 8 wide. And we'll have of this div will have a label that's going to say ID, and then we're actually just going to have a value for this. So let's just put a span, and we'll say at person.id, and then we'll have, let's fix this formatting here. And so we'll have another one, div class equals form group, and we're going to have a label for this, and this is going to be first name, and then we're going to have an input text that's going to have change this to be an input date. And then we need a button here. Class equals btn, btn dash primary. And we have a type equals submit. And say update person. Okay, so now we have our update person. And we do need to have our validation on here. So up at the top here, we'll have our data annotation validator, and we'll have our validation summary. So now that we have this set up with our validation, it's time to see if this even works. Okay, so we're not going to worry about making sure it's the right ID and all the rest. We're just going to pass an ID of 1 in for a minute and make sure that this is going to update. Okay, so we have our ID being passed in. We have our on update, so that when this comes back, we can validate that it's been done. And so when we submit something that's valid, we're going to update the person, and then we're going to say, hey, we're done, and here's the person. All right. So in theory, this all works, but let's make sure at least it displays right, and then we'll figure out how to put it in place more correctly. So down here in div, we can say we want the update person with an ID equal to 1. Yes, that's hard coded. This is just to make sure it displays. So let's run this and see what happens when we run our application. Okay, waiting for it. Kestrel will start it up, and now we have our page started up. read people, and we have an unhandled exception. Okay, this is why we test early and often. Now, Kestrel has some information here. If we look, in fact, let's expand this out. We have a fail, which is nice. It's in red. And it said we have another fail. We have a warn. So this fail right here is about a circuit, unhandled exception in the circuit, invalid operation. Edit form requires a model per person dot first name equals p dot first name. Person dot last name equals p dot last name, and person dot date of birth equals p dot date of birth. So I'm not going to create a new instance. I will just update the values in that instance. Let's try this again. Okay, but that's where, again, Kestrel is nice. It has the logs on the screen, and it color codes them for us so you can more easily see them. Read people. There we go. So now we have two entries here, Tim and Sue, and we have the edit for ID number 1, which is Tim, Corey, and here's the date of birth. And I can update this. In fact, let's do that. Let's update that to be the 18th and hit update person. Now nothing really happens. But if I go off and come back, notice that Tim now has an updated date of birth of 3/18. So technically we got an update working, but it's hard-coded to me. And even though I'm very, very popular, I'm sure maybe you want to update more people in your database besides just me. So how do we do that? Well, this is working properly, but now what we want to do is we want to display the edit form. So I'm going to create a couple of variables to help with that. The first one is going to be private bool, one too many O's there, bool, and this is going to be show edit form, and it's going to be false by default. Okay, and I'm going to say, let's wrap this whole thing. So I'm going to cut this out. If show edit form, then there's the edit form. Okay, so there's the first step I'm going to take is I'm not going to show it by default. Next, I'm going to create an integer, private int, and this is ID to update equals 0. And then this right here, this 1 at ID to update. Now, we're going to have to add a button here. So let's add a new header row. And we'll add a new value row as well. And in the value row, I'm going to create a button. Button class equals btn, btn-primary, and we're going to have it say update. That's fine. And in here, what's going to happen is we're going to have an on click, and I'm going to call a method. So I have no parameters, and then let's call the method. We don't have one yet, so we're going to say private void update user or update person with an ID. So I'm going to call this method. So update person, and the ID I'm going to pass in is p.id. Okay, so this button is going to be different for every person because it's going to take in a different ID, and we'll pass that to the update person. Update person is going to say ID to update equals ID, and now show edit form. Well, show edit form equals true. There we go. So that should be the first step we need to take. So let's run this and make sure this first step works. So it should be that we don't see the form at first, and then when we click on update, let's maximize this. When we click on update, it shows Tim's record. Okay? Now if I hit update on Sue, notice it's now Sue's record. So we're getting closer, because this works great except for, let's just change Sue's record to 01/25/2020, update. It's not refreshing yet. It did refresh the database, but it didn't refresh this field, and it's not hiding that form afterward. So let's work on those two things. So we have this callback on update, which passes back the person record. So what we can do is we can handle that. So we have the on update equals handle on update. Okay. Actually, not quite, because that won't call it with any parameters. Well, let's wire up first. And we're going to say private void handle on update with the, I believe it's iPerson model being passed through. It is a iPerson model being passed through. So iPerson model person. And that is supposed to call this. All right, so it should pass the data through, but we're going to see if it actually does. First thing we're going to do is we're going to say show edit form equals false. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is just not show it. Let's just stay right there. I'm going to put a breakpoint here. Once it, come on, there we go. So there's a breakpoint. And if we read people, I'm going to edit Sue, and I'm going to say, let's put a Y at the end of Sue's name. Update person. The person object actually is passing through. So the person object is Sue Stormy. So that's good. And if we take the breakpoint off and we hit continue, the page now has hidden that update form. So that's great, but it's not refreshed Sue's record. So to do that, what we'll need to do is we'll need to figure out which record to update. But we have this list of people right here. So what we can do is we can say var updated, let's just say p equals, and we'll say people dot where, and we'll give it a x dot id equals person, whoops, double equals, person dot id. So we're going to match based upon the IDs. First or default. If p is not equal to null, then what we can do is we can update this record. So p is now the record on our side. So p.firstname equals person.firstname. p.lastname equals person.lastname. And p.dateofbirth equals person.dateofbirth. Let's see this in action. Okay, so we're going to launch it again, and we're going to try updating Sue's record back to Sue Storm. So we have Sue Stormy right now. Well, no, it's actually Sue Storm. Update, and now notice that Sue Storm has been updated. Update Tim Corey, and I'm going to say, well, let's go with formal here, so Timothy Corey, and now it's been updated. And with that, we've now completed the update portion of this code. Yes, that can be a little bit complicated, and yes, we've got a few things going on that we have to play around with, make sure we get right, but at the end of the day, update is really just like an insert or create. It's just we have to pass around that ID, because that ID is important. It identifies who we want to update. Okay? So with that, that's it for this lesson. Practice this, try it out, try it on your own. Maybe play with my code and then try and redo it in your own. And then once you're ready, move on to the next lesson where you figure out how to delete records.